What else what is your take on the Supreme Court today, just as an institution after all these years?
Oh, it's very dicey. And what's dicey are the freedoms that depend upon whether the courts enforce the Constitution or whether they go off on their own social adventures. I think the greatest disappointment with this court was Chief Justice Roberts disregarding the 10th Amendment and finding some terribly clever way of evading it and declaring Obamacare constitutional. You know, the 10th Amendment says that the government has only such powers that are specific, the federal government has only such powers as are specifically designated to it, and all other powers either belong to state governments or belong to the people themselves. There is no power for the federal government to tell people what kind of medical insurance they have to buy, even if they prefer something else. But because I have no idea what terribly clever reasons the Chief Justice might have had, but once you knock down the 10th Amendment, there's really nothing the government can't order us to do.
Here's another clip of, we talked out in Palo Alto in 2005, and it's very brief, it's only 20 seconds, and I want you to give us your reaction to what you said then. What's the impact of 9/11 on this country and the world?
Oh my gosh, we will never be the same again. I'm disappointed in people who seem not to realize that it's not business as usual anymore. That it's really, there are things we have to do that we don't want to do, but the alternative is far worse.
That was actually 2005, and here we are 12 years later. What would you say today if the same question was asked?
I think I'd give the same answer, and I'd be more apprehensive today because the previous administration has now given Iran the go-ahead to develop nuclear weapons, and Iran is testing intercontinental missiles. Now, the thing that they're supposed to be preparing to do is attack Israel. Israel is closer to Iran than Boston is to Denver, all right? You don't need intercontinental missiles to attack Israel. You need intercontinental missiles to attack people who are on another continent. And there's not a great mystery as to who would likely be the target of it if they ever decided to go that route. And I think right now we're doing what was done by the Western powers in the 1930s as Hitler was building up his war machine. You're going from day to day, and you're taking the easy path and avoiding the hard problems on the assumption that somehow or other you'll muddle through. And they came very close to not muddling through. France, of course, was conquered during World War II. Sometime in one of my columns recently, it may have been one of the last ones for all I know, I suggested that people who want to understand what is happening in the world today should read a book called The Gathering Storm, which is not about today. It's about the 1930s. But once you see this kind of feckless drifting in the face of fatal dangers, you'll understand what kind of thinking is going on, or lack of thinking, is going on today in the way that we're approaching the kinds of dangers we're facing now, which are far worse. Most people don't understand that for the first 3 years of World War II, the Western powers never won a single battle, literally, either in Europe or in Asia. They were beaten time and time again because the pacifists had gotten their way in the 1930s and prevented an adequate buildup of military forces, for which men paid their lives in those early years of World War II. Fortunately, at some point, the West learned their lesson. The United States entered, and with tremendous productive capacity, was able to supply itself, Britain, and the Soviet Union with the power of the weapons needed to defeat the Nazis and later the Japanese. But we're not going to have that kind of time in a nuclear war. You're not going to have 3 years to muddle around and get beaten and then come back. You will be lucky if we have a year to get beaten and still come back.
The Gathering Storm, as you said in that late column in December, was written by Winston Churchill. Is there anybody today, in your opinion, besides what you just said, that is suggesting that we ought to worry about the gathering storm in public life?
Oh, there are people who oh, you mean holding some official position?
Yeah, I mean, are there people that you respect?
Not that I've noticed. I mean, you don't get two Winston Churchills in one sentence in one century. Ronald Reagan would be the closest analogy, but of course he too is gone. Again, we never seem to look at what are the inherent constraints within which you're operating, and what can you do within those constraints. I think of Reagan, you know, when the Soviets started building up nuclear weapons in Eastern Europe, pointing at Western Europe. And Reagan responded by sending in American nuclear weapons in Western Europe, pointing in Eastern Europe. People were horrified and said, this man's going to get us into a war. We'll be annihilated. And fortunately, he disregarded them completely. And instead of getting us into a war, he brought the Cold War to an end. People who lived through the Cold War, with the fear of nuclear annihilation hanging over us all that time, have no idea what a feat that was. And he did it without firing a single shot at the Soviet Union. But you know, he was never, I don't think he was ever considered for a peace prize. You know, you don't get a Nobel Peace Prize for having produced peace. You get a Nobel Peace Prize for saying the kinds of things that people who are on the Nobel Committee think are going to promote peace, even though those things, such as the policies of Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain in the 1930s, said, which led to war.
Since you've been retired from writing your column, how closely have you paid attention to what's going on in this country and the world?
Oh, not nearly as closely as before. None of it is truly encouraging, however. Well, I won't say that. I think the new administration in Washington has some very good people, better than I think most recent administrations have had in the top positions. The only question is whether the president listens to them, and that we won't know until, you know, a lot more time has passed.